The night I finally stopped running, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. I was sitting on the back deck of my new place, a modest two-story in Kelowna, British Columbia, overlooking the vineyard that rolled out behind the property like something from a postcard. I'd poured myself a glass of local Pinot Gris, the kind of wine you can only really appreciate when you're finally genuinely alone for the first time in 4 years. The sun was going down over Okanagan Lake, and the sky was doing that thing it does in late September out there. All amber and rose and deep bruised purple, and for the first time, in as long as I could remember, I felt like myself again. Then my phone buzzed. Heard you bought a place in the Okanagan. Nice. We should talk about that. It was from my brother Theo. Theo Ashworth, 38 years old, failed real estate agent, full-time opportunist, and the person who had, 3 years earlier, convinced our parents to lend him $60,000 from their retirement savings to invest in a condo pre-sale that somehow never materialized. He'd never paid them back. He never would. And our parents, Warren and Lynn Ashworth, both in their late 60s, both retired teachers from Barrie, Ontario, had quietly absorbed the loss the way they absorbed everything Theo did, with a sigh and a shrug, and the unshakable belief that their son would eventually figure things out. I didn't respond to the text. I finished my wine. I watched the sun finish setting, and I thought, here we go. My name is Mara Ashworth. I'm 36 years old. For the past 11 years, I've worked as a forensic accountant, first with a mid-size firm in Toronto, then as a senior investigator with the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Centre of Canada, which most people know as FinTrack. My job, in plain terms, is to follow money. Specifically, money that people are trying very hard to hide. I'm good at it. I've contributed to files that resulted in fraud convictions, asset forfeitures, and at least 2 cases that made national news, though my name was never mentioned. I prefer it that way. I don't tell most people what I do for a living. At family dinners, I used to say I worked in financial compliance. It was boring enough that nobody asked follow-up questions. Theo thought I was some kind of mid-level bureaucrat who shuffled spreadsheets in a government cubicle. That suited me fine. The reason I'd bought the Kelowna house required some explanation that I was only now, sitting on that deck, beginning to fully process myself. 14 months earlier, I had separated from my husband of 6 years, a man named Patrick Gould. Patrick was 41, a commercial real estate broker in Toronto, charming in the particular way that men who sell things for a living tend to be charming. Effortlessly, strategically, and in ways that you only recognize in retrospect. We'd met at a mutual friend's wedding in Prince Edward County. He was funny and attentive, and he remembered small things, the kind of details that make you feel truly seen. He asked about my work in ways that suggested he actually cared about the answers. We got married at a small ceremony outside of Stratford. For a while, it was good. Then it wasn't. I won't spend too much time on Patrick because, ultimately, he's not the main character in this story. What matters is this. When our marriage ended, I discovered that he had, over the course of approximately 2 years, been quietly funneling money from our joint investment account into a separate account in his name alone. Not huge amounts at a time, amounts small enough that they wouldn't trigger automatic alerts, amounts carefully calibrated to look, on the surface, like ordinary transfer activity. It was, I had to grudgingly admit, when I finally sat down and mapped the full transaction history, genuinely competent financial maneuvering. The total, by the time I finished the analysis, was just over $214,000. He had no idea who he'd married. The divorce was handled by my lawyer, Genevieve Tremblay, who is 44, has an office on Bay Street, and has the quiet, settled energy of someone who has seen every possible variety of human bad behavior and is no longer surprised by any of it. Within 3 weeks of my formally retaining her, Genevieve had filed for full financial disclosure. Patrick's lawyer responded with a document package that was impressively incomplete. 2 weeks after that, I sat down with the transaction records myself, cross-referenced everything against publicly available filings, and 3 other data sources I had legitimate access to through my work, and produced a 40-page analysis that Genevieve described, with characteristic understatement, as thorough. The settlement negotiation took 4 months. Patrick kept the condo on King West. I received the full value of the diverted funds, plus my share of our joint assets, plus a structured payment arrangement for costs and damages. I also received, as a separate matter entirely, the satisfaction of watching Patrick's lawyer's face during the final meeting when Genevieve placed my analysis on the table and asked him, very pleasantly, whether his client would like to respond to the specific transactions outlined in Appendix C. Patrick did not look at me once during that meeting. Afterward, standing outside on Bay Street in the November cold, Genevieve asked if I wanted to grab a coffee. I said I needed to walk for a while. I walked from the financial district all the way up to Rosedale and back, and by the time I got home, I had decided I was leaving Toronto. I'd been renting a 1-bedroom on the Danforth since the separation, which was fine but felt impermanent in a way that was starting to wear on me. I wanted to own something. I wanted something that was entirely, unambiguously mine, on paper in fact, in every legal sense. I'd grown up spending summers in the Okanagan visiting my maternal grandmother, and I'd always told myself I'd go back someday. The divorce settlement gave me the financial foundation to do it. I transferred my role to a remote position. FinTrack had expanded its remote work arrangements significantly, and my supervisor agreed without hesitation. And in July, I bought the house in Kelowna. I didn't tell most people where I was going. I told my 2 closest friends. I told Genevieve. I did not specifically hide it from my family, but I didn't announce it either. I wasn't estranged from my parents. We spoke regularly, and I had no complicated feelings about them beyond the low-grade exhaustion that comes from watching 2 kind, responsible people continuously enable their son's worst impulses. Theo, however, I had essentially stopped engaging with after the retirement savings incident. I hadn't formally cut contact. I'd simply stopped initiating and stopped responding. He seemed unbothered. Until that text. Heard you bought a place in the Okanagan. Nice. We should talk about that. I didn't respond. A week passed. Then my mother called. Lynn Ashworth is 67 years old, and she has a particular tone of voice she uses when she is about to ask something she knows I won't like. It's slightly higher than her normal register, and she speaks faster, as if getting through the sentence quickly will reduce the impact of its content. We've been thinking, she said in that rough voice, that your father and I should really be thinking about downsizing. This was not new information. They'd been talking about leaving the house in Barrie for several years. That makes sense, I said. The market is really quite strong right now. Gordon and Ruth next door just sold for nearly $8,000, which is, well, your father nearly fell off his chair. She laughed. I waited. We've actually had a few conversations with Theo about it. And there it was. He's been doing some research, my mother continued, on various options. And, well, I don't want to put this the wrong way, Mara, but with a property the size of yours, there's certainly enough space. And we thought, maybe just temporarily, while we sorted out what came next. Mom, just a few months. You have that extra room, Mom. I kept my voice level. I have 1 spare bedroom. It's where I set up my office. Dad can't manage stairs anymore, and the main bathroom is on the 2nd floor. It's not a practical arrangement. There was a pause. Theo thought, I'd be happy to help you research retirement communities or bungalow listings in areas you like. I can put together a comparison for you, but I can't host both of you here long term. It genuinely doesn't work with the layout. After I hung up, I sat very still for a few minutes. Then I called Genevieve, not because I needed legal advice yet, but because she was the person I trusted most to think clearly. Your brother is behind this, she said immediately. Obviously. Do you know what he's told them? Not yet. Find out before they do anything with the house. She was right. I called my father that evening. Warren Ashworth is 69, a practical man who had spent 31 years teaching high school geography, and who generally expressed opinions only when he had thought them through carefully. I asked directly what Theo had proposed. There was a pause. He said he'd found a buyer for the house. A private sale, skipped the agent commission, said he knew someone. Another pause. He said he'd handle the paperwork. I felt something cold move through my chest. Dad, has anyone signed anything? Not yet. Theo said he'd bring the documents next weekend. I had 6 days. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury you can't afford in my line of work. Instead, I opened my laptop and I started doing what I do. The first thing I did was pull the title records for my parents' house in Barrie. Straightforward, the Ontario Land Registry is publicly accessible. The property was registered jointly to Warren and Lynn Ashworth. No encumbrances, no liens. Good. Nothing had been touched yet. Then I looked at Theo. He'd had his real estate license in Ontario, but it had lapsed 4 years ago. I confirmed this through the RICO public database in about 90 seconds. He had no current license, which meant that if he was representing himself as a licensed agent in facilitating a property sale, he was operating illegally under the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act. That was one issue. The second issue emerged when I started looking at the supposed buyer. Theo had mentioned, according to my father, someone he knew through business. I asked my father for any name or detail could remember. Dad said Theo had mentioned a numbered company. I asked if he remembered any part of the number. He didn't, but he remembered Theo had written something on a notepad that was still on the kitchen counter. He went and read it to me. A 7-digit Ontario Corporation number. I ran the number through the Ontario Business Registry. The company had been incorporated 11 months ago. The registered director was a man named Kevin Drost. I didn't know him, but the address on file was a commercial mailbox in Mississauga, the same address shared by 4 other numbered companies incorporated in the same 12-month period, all with different director names. The registration agent for all 5 was the same individual. This was a pattern I had seen before. Not identical to anything in my active files, but structurally familiar. Shell companies layered behind mailbox, addresses, registered in clusters, designed to appear as separate entities while functionally connected. Whether the intent here was money laundering, title fraud, or simply a mechanism for Theo to take a cut of a below-market private sale and obscure his involvement, I didn't know yet. But I knew it was wrong. I documented everything I had found. Then I called Genevieve. "You need to tell your parents not to sign anything," she said. "Tonight, I know. But if I call them and say, Theo is running some kind of shell company scheme, they're not going to believe me. They're going to think I'm being difficult." Genevieve was quiet for a moment. "Can you get to Barrie before next weekend?" "I can be there, Thursday." "Go Thursday. Bring your documentation. Don't lead with accusations. Show them the records and let them ask the questions." I booked a flight to Toronto for Wednesday evening. I didn't tell Theo I was coming. I didn't tell my parents either. I called my mother and said I was coming for a visit, which was unusual enough that she asked twice if everything was all right. I said everything was fine, I just missed them. I landed at Pearson at 9:30 Wednesday night, rented a car, and drove up to Barrie. The house looked the same as it always had. A brick 4-bedroom on a quiet crescent. The garden slightly overgrown since my father's knees had gotten worse. The old blue spruce in the front yard that had been there since before I was born. I sat in the rental car for a few minutes before going inside. I thought about what I was about to do. I was 36 years old, and I was about to sit down with my parents and tell them that their son, their favorite, if we were being honest, the one they'd always protected and explained away and quietly subsidized, was attempting to defraud them. Not borrow money he'd never repay, not make a bad investment with their savings, defraud them. Potentially redirect the proceeds of their home sale through a shell company structure that would leave them with less than full value, possibly significantly less, possibly nothing at all depending on how the scheme was structured. I took a breath and went inside. My mother had made tea. Dad was in his chair in the living room. I sat on the couch across from them both and I said, I need to show you something, and I need you to hear me out before you respond. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at me. I opened my laptop. I walked them through it methodically. The lapse license. My father didn't know it had lapsed, and his jaw tightened when I showed him the RICO search result. The numbered company. The registered address. The cluster of related companies. The registration agent. I showed them screenshots, printed records, the Ontario Business Registry entries side by side. I didn't use words like fraud or scheme. I described what I had found and what it suggested, and I let them interpret it. My mother started crying around the 20-minute mark. Not loudly. She's not a loud crier. Just quietly, her hands folded in her lap, tears running down her face. My father didn't cry. He got very still and very quiet in the way he did when he was thinking through something carefully. Finally, he said he was going to bring documents next Saturday. I know. Documents for us to sign, yes. And the company buying the house is not a legitimate buyer as far as I can determine. I don't know exactly what would have happened to the proceeds. I don't know if Theo understood the full structure or if he was being used by someone else, but I know you would have been at significant risk. My father looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he said, What do we do? First, you don't sign anything. Second, if Theo contacts you before I've had a chance to speak with the right people, you tell him you need more time to think about it. Don't tell him I'm here. I paused. Third, I need to make a report. This was the part I had been thinking about on the drive up from Toronto. What I had found wasn't just a family problem. The shell company cluster was the kind of pattern that warranted professional attention beyond my personal capacity to address. I couldn't use my FinTrack access for a personal matter. That would be an obvious conflict of interest and a potential breach of my conditions of employment. But I could, as a private citizen with relevant expertise, submit a tip to the appropriate authorities and provide documentation. I spent Thursday and Friday in Barrie, helping my parents understand their options. My mother barely spoke to me on Thursday, not out of anger, I think, but because she was processing something that required a complete reorganization of how she understood her son. On Friday morning, she came downstairs while I was having coffee and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, I don't understand how he could do this to us. I didn't have a good answer. I said, I don't either, but I'm glad you know. On Friday afternoon, Geneviève connected me with a colleague of hers, a lawyer named Robert Cho, who practiced primarily in financial crime and property law. Robert was 52, precise and calm, and he spent 40 minutes on the phone reviewing my documentation. At the end of the call, he said, This is worth pursuing formally. The structure you've identified has characteristics consistent with title fraud schemes that have been active in the GTA market. I'd like to pass this to a contact at the Ontario Securities Commission and also flag it to the local police financial crimes unit. Do that, I said. Saturday arrived. Theo arrived at 11 in the morning, driving a leased BMW that he definitely could not afford, carrying a manila folder, and wearing the particular expression of someone who believed the hard part was already done. He walked into the living room and stopped when he saw me. Mara. He recovered quickly. He always did. I didn't know you were coming. I know, I said. Sit down, Theo. He looked at our parents. Our mother was sitting very straight in the armchair she always sat in. Our father was standing near the window, which was unusual. He preferred to sit. Theo registered something in the room then, some shift in the atmosphere, and his recovery came slightly slower this time. What's going on? Sit down, my father said. I let our parents do most of the talking. My father had been a teacher for 31 years. He knew how to present information clearly, and he knew how to hold a room. He walked Theo through what they had learned. He didn't raise his voice once. Theo started to interrupt twice, and my father simply waited until he stopped and then continued. When my father finished, Theo looked at me. You did this, he said. I looked at publicly available records, I said. And I found what I found. You've always done this. Every time I try to do something, you, Theo. I kept my voice entirely even. The company you were going to use to buy this house is a numbered corporation with a registered mailbox address in Mississauga. It was incorporated 11 months ago and shares its registration agent with 4 other companies set up around the same time. You've held no active real estate license for 4 years. I have all of this documented. I paused. Robert Cho has already been in contact with the Financial Crimes Unit. The shift in Theo's face was not dramatic. He didn't go pale or stammer. But something behind his eyes recalibrated, and for just a moment he looked like what he was, a person who had believed he was the only one paying attention. He left 20 minutes later without the signed documents. In the weeks that followed, Robert coordinated with the relevant authorities. The investigation into the shell company structure was taken up formally by the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit and the OSC. I learned later, through Robert, not through any privileged access, that the registration agent connected to those companies was already known to investigators in relation to 2 previous title fraud complaints in Peel Region. Theo was interviewed twice. He was not, as far as I know, the primary architect of the scheme. He appeared to have been recruited as a facilitator, someone with family connections who could deliver a motivated vendor, which was perhaps a marginally more charitable interpretation of his conduct, though not one that made me feel significantly better about him. My parents listed their house properly, with a licensed agent, and sold it 8 months later for $760,000. They bought a 2-bedroom bungalow in Collingwood, 15 minutes from Georgian Bay. My father can manage it on his knees. My mother has a garden with actual room for tomatoes. Theo called me once, about 2 months after the Saturday confrontation. He didn't apologize. He said he hadn't really understood what he was involved in, which may or may not have been true, and that he thought I could have handled it differently. I said I disagreed. He said I'd always thought I was better than him. I said that wasn't true. I'd just always paid more attention. He hung up. I went back to Kelowna. The vineyard behind my house had started its harvests, and the whole valley smelled of ripe Merlot and something darker beneath it, dry earth and coming cold. I sat on my back deck with another glass of Pinot Gris and thought about all of it. Patrick, Theo, my parents, the house in Barrie, the shell companies, and the Manila folder, and my brother's face when he walked into that living room and found me already there. People like Theo, and people like Patrick, operate on the assumption that the people around them are not paying close attention, that the people who love them are too trusting to look carefully, too loyal to ask hard questions, too conflict-averse to follow a paper trail to its end. Usually they're right. Most people don't know how to read a corporate registry. Most people trust family. I am not most people. And the longer I sat on that deck, watching the last light go over the lake, the more clearly I could see the shape of the lesson I kept being asked to learn. That knowing how the money moves is not a professional skill. It's a form of protection. For yourself, and sometimes, if you're willing to make the drive to Barrie on a Wednesday night, for the people you love. I set down my glass. The evening was quiet, and the valley was gold and mine. I didn't need anyone to tell me I'd done the right thing. I already knew.